11. Thanks again for watching these YouTube clips. I know I'm making you do that and you're being forced to, but I appreciate it. Okay, in terms of today's topic, we're going to be looking at the Constitution and two key aspects to do with our Constitution. That is the division of powers doctrine and the separation of powers doctrine. Now, before we start on those two sections of the Constitution, just a quick chat about the Constitution. It's often overlooked how important this document is. It sets out the rules by which our country is to be governed. It's kind of like looking at, say, Monopoly or another board game. It gives you the basic instructions, but in the Constitution's case, detailed instructions, on what our politicians can do, what our judiciary, which is our courts, can do, so that they can't overstep their bounds, their authority. It is vital and very important that we have this in place. It's difficult to change our Constitution. Only 10% of referendums, and a referendum is how we amend the Constitution under Australian law, only 10% of them have passed. That's because you need the majority of people voting in favour of a change to the Constitution. And on top of that, you need a majority of states. So 90% of the time when issues have gone before the Australian people, they've failed. In terms of the two important aspects that we're looking at to do with our Constitution today, one is the division of powers and one is the separation of powers. The division of powers divides authority power between the three levels of government, but mainly between the federal and the state governments. And each level of government in Australia looks after different things. In terms of the separation of powers, we have again, authority and power divided by three parts of the Australian authorities. That is the legislature, which is parliaments, all MPs and senators. You have the executive, which is again part of parliament, but it's cabinet, it's a key makeup of parliament. And you have the judiciary, which is the court system. I'll get back to that in a minute. In terms of the division of powers, I mentioned before that we divide authority between the federal and the state government. And they each have different areas they look after. And it does kind of make sense, for the most part, which level of government looks after which particular aspect of law. So, if you were to take a look at something like immigration, or especially defence, it wouldn't make sense to get each state to have their own navy, army, etc. to defend our country. So in terms of things like immigration, defence, they're looked after by our federal government. Things like education are looked after by our state governments. Healthcare by our state governments. Now, moving on to the second part of the Constitution I want to address today, we're taking a look at that separation of powers doctrine. Now, I've used the term doctrine a few times. Doctrine takes a look at a theory, the Constitution, what it's there to do. So in terms of the separation of powers, it has lots of checks and balances. These are processes in place to make sure that no one person can take full control of a country. And in terms of this separation of powers, there is, again, as I briefly mentioned before, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. Now, the legislature are our members of parliament, our MPs. They represent an area. Now, that area is called, what do you think? Yes, it's an electorate. Okay, they represent an electorate, an area. Then we have the judiciary. The judiciary, they're there to decide upon cases. So that's where we talked previously in other YouTubes about common law that's created in courts through the doctrine of precedent. So they're there to often keep in place and to have those checks and balances, the legislature and the executive I'm going to talk about in a second. So if our Prime Minister of the day did something that was crazy, something silly, something that seemed seriously inappropriate, which often they usually do, then the High Court, which is the apex, the top of our judiciary, it will be tasked with the job to review what those politicians have done. And they can overturn decisions that they've made. And that happens quite often. And the last part of this separation of powers doctrine is the executive. It's the cabinet. It's the top part of the legislature, and they're the ones who make the key decisions in Parliament. Kind of like in a school, you'll have all of the teachers, the head teachers, the deputies and the principal. That's the legislature. The cabinet or the executive part of that legislature would be probably the executive. So people like the head teachers, people like the deputy, and also the principal would kind of be like our Prime Minister. Well, that's it, Year 11. Thank you for watching this YouTube clip. And again, if you've got any questions, you can ask me in class or you can message me on Slack. See you later.